I'd like to welcome everyone to our discussion, which we're calling Classicism in the Sky, organized by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. My name is Stephen Wallace. I'm the author of a magazine article that helped inspire this discussion, and I'll be the evening's moderator. I will leave most of the talking to these gentlemen, and I will introduce them in just a moment. Before I do that, I've been asked to give some thanks. First to Robert A.M. Stearns Architects for hosting, and then also to the event sponsors. RINC, the lead annual sponsor for ICAA's public programs, as well as Del Mitchell Architects and Hyde Park Moldings, the seasonal public program sponsors. So our distinguished panelists, who no doubt need little introduction to this audience, two of whom work in these offices, but I'll give you the abbreviated versions. Dan Lobitz, partner at Robert A.M. Stearns Architects, joined the firm in 1986. He has been responsible for the design and management of a diverse range of projects, from urban planning and mixed-use developments to multifamily residential buildings, hotels, and private houses. The list of Dan's projects here in New York City includes 70 Vestry, Abington House on the Highline, 30 Park Place, and 261 Hudson Street. He also leads the design of Rams's licensed product program and cherry picking from his list of outside affiliations. I'll mention that he serves on the board of directors of Puppies Behind Bars, which is a very cool organization.
Very sad.
Yeah.
Tragic.
Paul Whalen, partner at Robert A.M. Stearns Architects since 1989, has been responsible for major urban planning projects such as the town of Celebration, Florida, and the revitalization of New York's 42nd Street. His portfolio of residential projects, which stretches from Miami to Los Angeles to Taipei, includes, here in New York, 15 Central Park West, 220 Central Park South, 520 Park Avenue, and 200 East 83rd Street, which I believe is just completed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul also has extensive experience designing healthcare and academic buildings, and he is the chair of the board of directors for the Sir John Soanes Museum Foundation in New York. Peter Penoyer is the founding partner of Peter Penoyer Architects, the firm he started in 1990 in New York, which has offices just around the corner, and also an office in Miami. Responsible for the design or renovation of countless apartments and houses, his notable projects include a residence for artist Jeff Koons and his family on the Upper East Side, the Czech Cubist-style house in Ohio known as Rowdy Meadow, and a couple of Upper East Side apartment buildings that he'll talk about tonight. Peter is the author or co-author of multiple books, including the monograph Peter Penoyer Architects City Country, which is being published this fall by Vendome Press. Peter is a past chairman of the ICAA, the current president of the Whiting Foundation, and a trustee of the Morgan Library and Museum. I'm an editor and writer based here in New York. I worked at a number of art, lifestyle, and design magazines, including Architectural Digest, where I was the executive editor for 5 years. And since leaving there, I've contributed to various publications, including Gallery Magazine, for which I serve as the contributing features editor. As mentioned, the impetus for the discussion this evening was in part a story I wrote for Veranda last summer that was about the recent wave of classically inspired high-rise architecture. For those who have not read the story, excuse me, it highlighted buildings by Stephen Harris, Bill Sofield, and Lucien Lagrange, as well as, of course, Robert A.M. Stearns Architects and Peter Penoyer. These luxury residential buildings, sometimes lumped under labels like New Classicism, are fairly diverse stylistically, and most of them blend some elements of modernism and classicism. So it can be a little bit challenging to talk about them collectively. In my story, I suggested what links them, and I'll paraphrase myself here, is a shared embrace of traditional design language, material richness, and craftsmanship in pursuit of a stronger expression of character and a distinctive sense of home. Clearly, there is a substantial market appetite for this type of architecture, whether that's due to a disenchantment with glass towers or other factors, which we will talk about. I want to kick things off by jumping right in and asking the three of you a question you probably will hate, but can
try it.
Maybe not. Can we call these traditionally inspired towers a trend? Or putting it another way, has the pendulum of taste, at least in the upper tiers of the real estate market, swung toward classically oriented architecture?
I think the answer is yes. I think that certainly in New York, there is a huge demand for more classical buildings these days. And I think that, first of all, I think we're living through another golden age of architecture in New York. And it's not since World War II have such quality buildings been going up, and have our developers spent so much money on the quality of their buildings because the market's come around. So I think we're very lucky. But, and along with that has come a desire to look back at some of the best buildings that were ever built in the world for multifamily residential in New York. We have the best stock in the city, and so it just makes so much sense to look back at it. But I have to say that we do work in China too, and in China, New York is a great brand, and they want their buildings to look like New York buildings.
Yeah.
And so it's everywhere.
And I don't like calling it a trend, because trend implies that it's in style now and it's going to go back out of style. And I would say that it's more of a phenomenon that in many ways was inevitable, because I think New York has such a great tradition of fine, classically inspired residential architecture. I think it set the pace, I think, more so than any other city in the world, perhaps. And then we lost our way after Second World War and started building really low quality, quote unquote, many times modern residential buildings. And I think more recently, I think partially because of the work of the people here on the panel and others, we started to look back at the way things that had been done back in the beginning, and started to revisit those ideas. And I think that people have really embraced that approach, because I think our buildings, our classically derived buildings, feel more like home to people than a glass tower.
Right. I mean, I think there are two parts of it. One is a trend that started with the preservation movement and the concern of the city and landmarks, landmark districts, and treasuring the sense of place that is New York. You see this in other markets, real estate markets, places like Savannah or Charleston, where there's an identity, an architectural identity that people increasingly value. And I also think it is that people are interested in interiors, what the insides are like, and are interested in rooms. And I think this firm brought back, I think, the dining room in these large apartments in 15 CPW. That just wasn't a thing in any of these white brick buildings. So I think it's the rooms, the demand for that kind of plan and thought and character inside the buildings that leads to window arrangements and the arrangements of facades that preclude glass curtain wall.
Yeah. So you all mentioned things that I will come back to again. Maybe we should sort of step back and have the three of you help kind of frame the discussion and explain in your words what defines the types of buildings that we're talking about, and also have you talk about some of the ways, specific ways you've adopted elements of classical design language in the buildings that you've created. Maybe a good place to start actually is 15 Central Park West, which wasn't the first traditionally inspired building that Ramza ever did, but was certainly hugely influential and a major success from a real estate marketing and sales perspective.
Right. First, I want to say, by the way, that since we're doing this in our office, there are people in this group who have worked on these projects, but most importantly, Michael Jones, a partner here, who was really important, and we worked together on many of these projects, almost all of them. So just a shout out to Michael. And so on 15 Central Park West, what I guess the question is, what makes it a sort of a modern classical building? Is that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, and talk about how, and you don't have to. You can talk about other buildings as well, but and one of the things that I'd like either of you, to address is the process of kind of scaling up that kind of architectural language to buildings that are 60, 70, 80 stories tall, which is something that, of course, the firm is well known for. And taking that language, that tripartite structure, and translating it into a tall, super tall even building.
Well, 15 Central Park West was not really a super tall yet,
Right.
and at this point, it almost looks like a sort of a New York fabric building from the old days. And in fact, Michael and I have given tours around Central Park South where people ask, "Well, did they renovate this building, or is it a new building?" Which to me, I'm just flabbergasted by it, because to me, it really looks like a new building. And but what makes it what it is that it's a masonry building. It happens to be a limestone building, which was a big bet by the Zeckendorfs. It was the first limestone building built in New York in a very long time. And it has punched windows in it. One of the great qualities of doing a tall building, by the way, in this traditional way, is that the stone or the brick becomes a field, and that is the background. And that you have an additional tool that somebody who does a glass building never has, which is that the windows are figures that you can play with on that field. And so I know this is getting a little architecty, but it makes a huge difference to be able to have that tool that you can play with windows and create figures on this facade and break down the scale without even getting into moldings and things like that, just by the arrangement of the windows. And windows can be grouped together to create mid-scale on the building, which is something that we did at 15 Central Park West. And we really got that idea from River House, by the way. We were looking very specifically at River House, one of the most elegant pre-war buildings that has these beautiful rows of vertical bays.
Well, they're joined by spandrels, right? So.
Right. But those bays are wonderful because they make the buildings look thinner. And also they allow you to sort of get out and look up and down the street, or up and down the river in that case. But so beyond that basic level of figure on field window on masonry, which is incredibly helpful, there's of course the traditional bottom, middle, top, which is very clear in those buildings. And the notion that when you're walking down the street, we love our city, we love New York, and you can't always have retail. Sometimes architecture needs to do the job. To make for an entertaining and safe feeling street. And we did that with 15 Central Park West. And we've done that with all the buildings since then. And I have to say that at 15, especially working at, there's a low building and there's a tall building. And it was the first time where we were working on a tall building where it seemed so big that you couldn't put it on a desk. We're used to sort of buildings that are small enough that you can see the whole thing on your desk. And we really had to put enormous elevations up on a wall and scrawl on the elevation on a wall so you could see it all at the same time. Later, with buildings that were 400 feet taller than that, we had an even rougher time of how do you understand all this detail that you're working on and make sure that it all makes sense when you lay it out. That's one of the extraordinary, difficult things about creating something that makes sense in a classical language.
And then in terms of scaling up, which you asked about, how do you scale it to a much taller building? Paul kind of touched on this, but I think that 30 Park Place is a good example. And when we started designing that in 2009, of course there was a crash, and then it went on hold for, I think, 6 years with just a big hole in the ground. But that was to be at that point the tallest residential building in Manhattan, and of course many others came actually a little earlier than it got finally finished and were taller up around Central Park. But we always work by looking at examples and looking at what others have done in the past, and there were no examples of residential buildings to look at in that regard. Really the closest thing is something like the Waldorf Astoria, which is maybe 700, or I think it's 600 and some feet tall. The Carlisle Hotel, a little shorter than that, but still a skyscraper. People did, at the beginning of the skyscraper era, start to build tall residential buildings. Zoning precluded them from being called or being officially residential buildings, so they built apartment hotels. Then later the zoning changed, and there were, of course, all those wonderful skyscrapers along Central Park West that use the language of a tall building. But we also looked at office buildings like One Wall Street. I think creating verticality, and Peter mentioned grouping windows with spandrels into vertical elements, even if it's not a bay window, as at 15 Central Park West. Peter used that device at 151 East 78th Street, which in many ways is a much more classical building. That's sort of a deco touch, though, to, I think, gather the windows together in a vertical detail like that. But you need to create larger scale elements on a bigger building. You need to have the intimate scale. You need to have the scale, what do you see from a distance, the silhouette on the skyline. So there are a lot of considerations.
You sort of addressed this a little bit with what you just said, but I'm curious, and another thing that you didn't talk about is the typology of the villa and tower behind, which was kind of a new thing for, at least for new buildings, certainly, and something you repeated with 220. What are some of the ways, subtle or unsubtle, that you make the tall buildings distinct from one another in order to avoid having a kind of Ramsar look? How do you think about that?
Well, I think there is a Ramsar look, first of all. They definitely. Some people would say, oh, they look a lot alike. And what I would say to them is, and I told Bob this when somebody told this, I said, Bob, this is like somebody telling you, well, you have 5 beautiful daughters, it's just too bad they look a little too much alike. It's just such a shame. You should create more variety in your children, And so, like, who cares? But we do actually make an effort to make them different. And at the start, with a building like 15 Central Park West, we were looking actually for our detailing. We were looking at more abstract buildings, and we looked to Ruth Spitz, actually, for the detailing, because we didn't think we could ever afford the kind of detailing that we're doing more recently, because the market has developed and developers have sort of moved along with us, all of us, to be able to now realize that they can afford more detailing. And so there's a huge difference between the detailing that we did at 15 Central Park West and what we're doing at 200 East 84th or whatever, third Street. I mean, that's a much more sculptural building. It's precast at the top, it's stone at the bottom. But it has a muscularity to it and a sculptural quality to it that is completely different from what we did at 15 Central Park West. But we've also done other brick buildings in town, particularly downtown, that are quite different. Some of them are a bit more, I would say, sort of industrial. We're sort of looking at industrial buildings and making them residential. The Cortland, for instance, that we just finished for Related on between 22nd and 23rd. It's a brick building. And I mean, but when we do buildings in Midtown, developers often come to us and say, I want it to be like 15 Central Park West, but I want it to be better and different. And that's what Steve Roth said to us when he hired us to do 220. And then every step of the way, when we moved away from something like 15 too much, he'd say, no, I don't like it. And we'll bring it back this way. He didn't want it to be too different. So there's a market issue that there is a desire that developers want to sort of repeat a successful project more than we do. And we even looked at maybe doing a building that would have color, that would be terracotta, for instance, but the market just wasn't ready for it. The developers weren't ready to do like a pale green building or whatever, or something different. They really wanted to stick with and not get too far away from what we'd done before. But within those restrictions, I think we have pushed things around and developed our detailing. For instance, at 520 Park Avenue, that was done for the Zeckendorfs after we did 15 Central Park West, we looked at how we could detail the stone at the bottom of the building, and we cut the stone in a different way, and we used what's called shots on stone. And it's a cutting method from the 1930s that was used at Rockefeller Center, where they actually use shot on the cutting blades as a kind of grease, and it leaves kind of marks across the stone. And it's very beautiful. And if you look at Rockefeller Center, which has very little detailing, half the detailing is the fact that the stone is shots on. And so we used that at the bottom of that building to give it a texture that 15 Central Park West didn't have. It was much simpler.
Peter, your firm has done two quite different, I guess you could say, apartment buildings in the city that I'd love to have you talk about. 151 East 78th, which happens to be across the street from another
Right.
Ramsa building.
We did have beautiful views until, well,
Sorry, we stepped on your toes there, buddy.
And the Benson on Madison Avenue,
Yes.
just north of
Yeah.
79th Street, which you completed last year.
yes.
When we spoke for my story, you told me people value character and a sense of place. So maybe in talking about these two buildings, you could kind of address how your design addresses that.
Right. So I mean, to start with 78th Street, I mean, it's a charming residential street. The closest neighbor is a row of tiny 19th century brick houses called the Gimbel houses. Mr. Steinor Gimbel was still living in one of them when we started. And so it had to straddle the character of the street, of this low-scale street, and also the fact that it was west of Lexington Avenue, which used to be a brave thing to do for a developer, is no longer the case. And so,
East of Lexington Avenue.
excuse me, east. Yes, west. West is where I want to be. West is where I want to be. West of Park. So it's a brick building, but it has limestone detail and a limestone base, and the limestone base allows us to relate the scale of the streetscape to the lower street. And we studied the detailing a great deal to avoid having it look like it wasn't self-supporting masonry on the base. And this is an architect issue, but it's really important. And I look at Rams's buildings and I see how they handle these issues, and it's really what makes the buildings sing. We also had to deal with the massing, which sets back and creates the problem of an inherent asymmetry, which then you address by composing the windows, as Paul explains, in bands to create a scale that then relates to different parts of the facade. We then added, which we thought the developer wouldn't pay for, balconies, wrought iron balconies, with an Anthemian motif, which is a Greek revival motif. And they were surprised because when you do one thing on a building like this, it turns out you have to do 84 of them. But we kept drawing it, and we ended up having it fabricated in China. The shop drawings were so abysmal that we actually printed out at full scale a piece of the railing, painted it black, and sent it to China.
That's the best way to get things done in China. You got to
Yeah.
the big drawing,
Right,
the 3D
right.
drawing.
So that building, I think, is a successful part of that street, and it has an interesting presence on the skyline. It is difficult to convince a developer that they have to hoist 6-foot solid limestone urns on top of the skyline. It's
Very
a structural issue. But,
Keeps the building down.
yeah, it's
Float
their
away.
markers. And we also designed the interiors of that building. So every single molding on the interior, every detail of the bathrooms and the kitchens and the lobby. So that was incredibly satisfying to be in control of that one completely. The Benson has a totally different spirit. I say it's more like Candela. It's more deco. And it's all limestone again, and it has the bays that Paul mentioned. We saw first at the River House, Bottomley's great building, that setback again. The massing can work both for the building and for the neighbors because it set the building apart from its neighbor. and made it read, at least the center part of the facade, as a symmetrical composition. Both of the buildings have interesting tops, and New York requires you to have all sorts of mechanical equipment and other things that are just required, and they sit on the roof. And if you're even good architects like Chipperfield did a building across from the public library where he has all that stuff and it's simply in a fence. It's a box on top of a box. Mm-hmm. So that in a way is what not to do. Maybe they wouldn't pay for a top on the building, but the top on the building is where the action is. Yeah. And the other thing are the corners of these buildings. And in the Benson, they had the budget for us to sort of carve and chamfer away the corners, so it has a great kind of solid sculptural feeling as it emerges at the top.
Yeah. What you were alluding to is sort of variations in massing and also fenestration, which is something that I know you do a lot with. It's a way to get some variation in those taller buildings, particularly. As a way to sort of add character and distinctiveness, and maybe you could, and any of you can address this, talk a little bit more about how you use that sort of balanced asymmetry to create visual interest, and then also how sometimes the variations in massing relates to the interior space planning.
Right. Yeah, I think that when I look at our tall buildings, or the better tall buildings from the 30s and 40s, I think of them as that they're like a vertical village, and that in a really nice village, to say New England Village, you have the sort of normal streets with the normal houses, and they're all lovely, and not everybody can have the big house. And then there's also the big street, say at the top of the hill, where the big houses are. And and everything's open to everybody, and you can live in that village in one of the smaller houses and be very proud of the big house because it's part of your neighborhood. There's a civic pride in all of it. And when you have people visiting you, you show everybody. And I think that in a big building, by showing and expressing the fanciest units at the top, instead of hiding them in a box, you're doing everybody a favor because it makes the building more interesting. It also allows everybody in the building, I think, to take pride in that sculptural interest at the top, in the way that you take pride in the big house on the hill, even if you don't live in it. And it also gives something back to the city because you can see it from a distance. And I also think that in a time when everybody can afford just to slather marble all over everything, that the only, like maybe the greatest luxury we have left is a sense of individuality. And so I think that one of the reasons our buildings do well is that when somebody looks up at those facades, they can see all these different things going on, and they know that not everything's the same, and that they can get individual apartments that are different in terraces, and there might be more repetition than they think, but it looks like it's varied. And in fact, brokers really push us actually to make an enormous variety in apartments so that when they go to market, they can say there are only 3 of these, and not even lie about it. It's actually true. Before they used to lie, but now it's actually true. And so that means a lot of designing, a million different kinds of apartments, and then trying to express those on the outside is really hard. Getting all the windows to be brilliant for all those different rooms, and then having the apartment types shift as you go up and having to take care of the shifting symmetries that you were talking about. But I think the resolution of those symmetries, and as you classicists out there would know, is one of the most interesting things you can do on a building. That's one of the most fun things we get to do is resolve all those crazy shifts as they go up, and it does make the buildings more dynamic.
But I do think that balanced asymmetry is by no means a requirement, and no means do we do that on every building, because we've done a lot of completely symmetrical buildings. 70 Vestry is basically completely symmetrical on the riverfront. The side elevations, the north and south, are asymmetrical. 30 Park Place is symmetrical on each of its elevations. It's like an iconic obelisk that rises up and is completely symmetrical. But what is very important, I think, in a residential building is a sense of, and Paul alluded to this a little bit, a sense of individuality and a sense of specificity in their elements. You can point up and say, oh, you see that balcony there, that's my apartment. Or, oh, I wonder who lives behind that double height bay window.
Well, every one of your buildings has a top that I could do a sketch of if you handed me a piece of paper, because it has a certain character that I can relate to an architect, right? And you can look at them. We can't look at them today. We'll wait till the smoke clears.
You could do a table setting one.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's the extraordinary thing that you're adding to the skylight, sort of the landscape of the skylight. I also think, before we get off of it, that the way you handle the retail on Broadway and the way we all have to handle retail is really interesting, because there is this tendency in commercial buildings to strip off all the architecture at the base and put glass down to the sidewalk. And then what we're observing now is that commercial tenants are coming in and then covering up the glass in order to kind of create the proscenium of the framed window.
Terrible.
And so your buildings actually, and I've done this too, create the frame and don't give up the architecture.
Right.
And it's a terrible affliction now in New York, all the masonry getting stripped.
Yeah.
You know, we've had
Talk about
good luck at 150 East 78th. I think the retail there is quite charming. They allowed us to do nice stonework, pretty good metal work. It was toned down a little bit from our original designs, and now we're excited that some really wonderful shops are moving into iconic, the hot chocolate place. I think it's called Angelina, which is an iconic Upper East Side. They moved from Central Park South, and Vinci moved in, and it looks like it's always been there. It looks like, and of course it's Lexington Avenue, but it looks more like
I'm heading there in the
Madison
morning.
Avenue.
I'm going to mention.
So we're excited about that, because I think that's an ongoing problem, to get like really wonderful retail frontages and get also wonderful retail tenants.
That is
in
so
these new
important,
buildings.
and it's so important that the architecture engage the sidewalk and reach up. I mean, it sounds like such a trite idea, but you know.
When I first started working on these kinds of buildings, I was always very bothered by how do you deal with the big shop front windows underneath this huge masonry tower? How does it make sense visually? And because of the tectonics of all the stone coming down. And then so in New York is an encyclopedia of solutions. By the way, all you have to do is get in a taxi and you'll find all the solutions. And so I was walking up 6th Avenue, and on some of these old buildings that were department stores originally, what they did with their storefronts is they actually are almost like greenhouses glommed onto the building. And so they don't look like holes cut out of the building, where you sort of imagine, well, how's that hole holding up this whole building? There's a sort of sleight of hand where by adding this greenhouse-like thing, it's an object at the bottom of the building, even though there's still a hole there. And so a lot of the logic and the sort of pleasure of looking at buildings that seem to hold together are by just learning at what other people have done. And then I noticed that they did the same thing at Rockefeller Center, where the windows are punched out above, but the storefronts are actually applied onto the surface. So you imagine that the stone goes through somehow, and then there's this beautiful piece of bronze trim, and the window's actually pulled out slightly.
And you get a
from the
very
stone.
delicate scale on that metal.
Exactly.
It's absolutely precious, and it's pedestrian scaled.
Learning from the brilliant things that architects have done in New York is something that we will never get tired of.
Right.
And there's so much to learn and so much to apply to everything that we do today.
Talking about inspiration, I know that the kind of great apartment houses designed by architects like J.R. Carpenter, Rosario Candela, and Emery Roth are influences for all of your work. Peter, I know you certainly have cited them as inspiration, and we talked about that a bit. In my story, I used a quote from Bob Stern, which I'll read, and I'll ask you to add your perspective to it. The intelligence of the New York apartment house as it evolved was thrown out the window to a shocking extent after the Second World War. Now we're bringing it back. I wanted to ask all of you, talk about what shifted in the post-war era.
Well, the classical education was thrown out the window, for one thing. In many things, in architecture, and basically all these Germans came over here with their modern ideas and everything changed. It's just terrible things happen. And they got hired by Harvard, and they've never left. They're still there. It's all classical up at Harvard, or it's still modern at Harvard. And so it just changed education. And suddenly, teaching the history of architecture went out of style.
At Yale, they had a sidewalk sale. Alan Greenberg walked by as a student and bought 4 architectural treatises and 18 Saarinen drawings for $37 because they were literally selling it outside the library. All those books are gone. Some of them are in my library now. I have to explain to my employees, we didn't steal them. They were deaccessioned.
And of course, modernism puts a premium on efficiency, mass production, and all of that. So that had its influences, but I think it also corresponded with a time when there was just less money around and developers were very happy to do something that was less expensive, low ceilings, very repetitive. I think the white brick apartment building is kind of emblematic of that. But
well, it's interesting though. I mean, the post-war era is really, it's thought of as, although there, how true this is, probably could be debated, but thought of a time of prosperity and promise, and there was a lot was happening, and yet the choices that were made about the kinds of buildings that were built doesn't seem to reflect that spirit. There are some counterexamples to that, but
I think there's an actual cultural prejudice against traditional architecture. People were going to Harvard and getting that kind of education about the world outlook. And in fact, the white brick building that's the most shocking is a beautiful classical building that was fully limestone at 910 Fifth Avenue, 72nd. You walk by there, you'll notice an odd problem with it. The distance between the window head and the sill above is about 6 feet. They stripped off all of the limestone. They had a waterproofing problem.
And
they covered it with white brick. Right.
Slick move.
Right. Slick. Right. So there was a prejudice against it, and there was an idea that you have a more modern living style.
But also I think that after the war there was less of an interest in cities and urbanism.
Right.
Everybody moved to the suburbs. It was about objects. Architects wanted to design objects in the woods or whatever, and it was about creating sculpture. There was just no interest in urbanism. And Peter, you made a wonderful point earlier talking about historic preservation. And I think it's so true that the historic preservation movement made people aware again of the importance of neighborhoods in places like Charleston and New York that were early because of the Christ figure of Penn Station being brought down. I think it was really important. And then postmodernism came in, which also brought back in the history of architecture. I think that was very important.
Some of the, maybe talk about some of the elements of the great New York apartment houses that you were trying to bring, and now maybe talking more about the interiors and the internal space planning. And one of the issues with some of those, boring white brick buildings was there was a lot of kind of bland uniformity, and a lot of the units were just stacked and long, corridors, and there just wasn't the kind of interesting variation of the internal space planning that creates interesting homes for people. Talk about a little bit about that and what you try to do. Of course, taking into account that people live very differently today than they did in the 1920s and 30s.
Well, of course, the repetition is a very obvious thing. In a white brick building, most every room is exactly the same width, and maybe a living room gets to be wider, and then every bedroom is an identical width, and they just repeat along in a row.
Alan Birnbaum is the architect who designed 90 or more of those white brick buildings. Was with an associate walking up 3rd Avenue and said, "Is that mine? I forget. Is that mine?"
He probably lived in a great Georgian house.
Right.
Yeah.
Fancy.
Yeah, and and you mentioned earlier that idea of sort of prosperity, and I think there was an idea that that things could be prosperous and people could get. Everybody could get an apartment, but the idea was everybody gets the same apartment.
But the way the apartments were staffed is like this complete transformation after the war.
Yeah.
Before the war, even a middle-class house would have 2 staff rooms and actually occupied if you look at the census. And then that all went away. And the cores in the Candela buildings are often the stair and the elevators, that sort of vertical wall that goes through, was often a separation between all the staff rooms and the kitchen and the public rooms. You know, at 770 Park, it's possible that some of the husbands didn't actually know. They had a vague awareness that there must be a kitchen behind that door where the butler emerges, you know, but it wasn't part of the apartment. And the way your cores are organized, I think, is an example of how you then have that transparency that was not in a Candela building.
But that's the big change from the Candela and the Candela buildings and the Embry Roth buildings. All of those staff rooms, people don't need them today. And so people that buy those apartments often have a hard time because of the layouts, figuring out how to renovate, turn those staff rooms into usable space for, you know, the normal owners of the apartment. And so those kinds of things have been, you know, we've rethought those plans. We are very attached to the idea of room making, a beautiful sequence of spaces, privacy. How do you differentiate a sort of more public realm from a more private realm? How do you manage circulation so that different users of the same apartment can have privacy and each be going about their business? So, for example, the parents could be having a cocktail party and the children could watch television and get back and forth to their room and also get something from the kitchen. So all of those considerations are much better managed in sort of a traditional layout with sequences of rooms and vestibules and galleries and halls and foyers.
I also think, by the way, that looking back at the Candela plans, maybe in particular, that the proportions are beautiful. The ceiling heights versus the widths of the rooms. And we've looked at 740 Park, especially at the plans at 740 Park. And what's interesting is when you first look at them, they look like this jumble of, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff going on. But when you look at them more carefully, they're completely systematic. That the living rooms tend to be 20 by 40, and the dining rooms tend to be 20 by 30. The master bedrooms are 20 by 25. They're almost always 20 feet deep. And the libraries are 20 by 20 often. And so there's this completely systematic idea that gets jumbled a bit because you have to take care of structure and you have elevators coming up and it's messy getting it all to work. But there is this idea as to what the perfect room dimension is for those ceiling heights. And then where the doors are located and when the windows are located, makes those rooms easy to furnish. The doors into a room, it's either right in the middle, and then you can put two tables on either side of that door, and you know how to furnish. But more typically, you enter a room at the edge, which allows you to furnish the center of it. You can put a sofa on a wall or a bed on the wall, and also when you shift an entrance to an edge, a door to an edge, it allows you to shift symmetries, just like you do on elevations. It allows you to shift symmetries in plans.
And he's also brilliant at arranging that exactly with the gallery, and that edge door allows him to have the door from the gallery, and you know that an incredible oblique view of every single opening.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you can go from an edge of one room to a center of another room, and there are all these surprises as you walk through. Which is one of the great things about those plans, by the way, is that you're making your way to the kitchen from the primary bedroom is an incredible adventure, and it's beautiful, and all the views are lined up, and there are axes and everything. It's all worked out. And I think that all those axes, the way that they're resolved, may not be understood fully by somebody that lives in them, but they understand the effect that it's having on their life. And they understand that there's a huge amount of thought that's gone into those plans, and they understand that there's a quality that they're getting to appreciate.
And I think it's very important to say that you cannot design a good floor plan without drawing furniture into it. You need to,
of course,
decide where is the bed going, where is the dresser going, where is the TV going to go in relation to the fireplace, because people want a TV and a fireplace. Where is the dining table, where is the sideboard, where do the extra chairs go? And so that also has an effect on where the openings go. Do you do them at the edges? Do you do them at one edge? Do you do them in the middle? So all of that helps to orchestrate the layouts. And I think you'd be shocked at how many architects, I think, get through architecture school and go through practice designing things without actually drawing a furniture plan.
And we've seen so many bedrooms where they weren't designed by firms like yours, where there is a door into the bedroom, there's a door, 3 doors for closets,
Yes.
there's a door for the bathroom, and there's a window, and there's literally no room for the. Well, it's very challenging, right?
Exactly.
Of course, even if you get to do everything like you did on 78, you still often have clients who will come in and bring their own designer and want to redo everything. Maybe that doesn't happen in your buildings, but
It happens in all the buildings. No matter how much money you put into the interiors, some people come in, they want to have their own designer redo it. But if you've gotten the bones right so that the rooms really fit together, it makes their decorator's life a lot easier. And that's what we're here for. Yeah. We want to keep those people very happy because they can be your friends.
They sure can
They're
be.
best
They can be
friends.
your wife.
Exactly. And that can even happen, but you know, an extreme case.
An important evolution. We started doing these traditionally inspired residential buildings in the early 90s, and a big thing that's evolved over time is that the market has demanded higher quality. Developers are spending more money. Back when we started with these buildings, the kitchens and the baths were also always imagined to be throwaways. You do it as cheaply as possible, and
Because people are going to
because the
redo it
assumption
anyway.
was that everybody would redo it. But these days, a lot of care, a lot of attention, and a lot of money goes into doing very high quality kitchens, very carefully thought out bathrooms, and I think a majority of people do not renovate those rooms. People still do wall finishes, they still do new moldings, they still open up a wall here and there, they make transformations. And honestly, if you have a building with 40 apartments, 50 apartments, it's a burden on everybody if 10 of those apartments are all being renovated at the same time. It's a nightmare.
We do our floor plans, by the way, with the thought of flexibility. We're always thinking, for instance, we love to do a primary bedroom and then a library and a living room, because that library then can function as a part of the public world of the apartment, or it could switch over and be this very private space next to the primary bedroom. Or somebody can make it into their closet. When even the biggest closet you make will never be big enough for some people. So the idea that, or there's one of the smaller bedrooms isn't off in a group of bedrooms with the children, as it were. You put it near the primary bedroom, so it can become a closet, a library, or the snore room, as we call it, with somebody. The husband who paid for it all goes to the smaller bedroom.
We call it the
That's very-
snoratorium.
Oh,
It
that's
sounds
very
better.
sexist.
You're right. Yeah, and
spouse
it's
that
completely
paid for it all.
incorrect. Sorry, it could be completely incorrect. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't even say like masculine, feminine. When they pay for it all,
Right. Yeah.
they will be annoyed because they will be in the small bathroom. Yeah. There you go.
So shifting gears.
I think I covered my face.
Yeah, you covered
was good.
We won't
covered
tell
it.
anybody.
He saved it.
So most buyers probably don't have a whole lot of awareness of who Candela and Roth were, and I don't imagine that kind of specific history really, or those references, mean all that much to most buyers. But do you think that there is a sort of more generalized nostalgic thing happening where people want to channel an earlier era? And so when I wrote my story, Peter Leiden said to me he thought there might be something of a COVID influence on this trend, if we're going to call it that. Here's what he said. I think the pandemic has pushed some people into wanting to live like where their grandparents did. I know that sounds kind of funny, but they want familiar surroundings, private and really cozy rooms. It's going back to this beautiful, gracious kind of living. Do you agree with that?
I think that
Whether or not the COVID part of it is,
added to
yeah.
a movement that had already started. And it's not a trend, it's a tsunami. That's what we should call it. But the trend had already started, and I think it has to do with, again, this love of great urbanism, I think is a part of it, love of neighborhoods that are great, and then wanting to move into a building that really feels like it's a part of this neighborhood, which is historic, say the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side, and there's nothing else like it in the world. Since you're buying into a neighborhood And why would you buy into a neighborhood and then buy the outlier building? It's nothing like the neighborhood. So in a way, what we're doing is tapping into the essence of New York, the essence of what makes the New York a very particular brand architecturally, internationally. I think that's one of the things that we're doing. And so when somebody moves to New York, they often have a thought in their minds of, well, this is what it would be like to live in New York. I know that when I first moved to New York, I thought, look at these little townhouses. I'd be happy to live in one of these things. And then I realized I would never be able to afford one. But there are people, so people have these notions of what it's like to be in New York. And if you can, so why throw all that out and design a building that can be built anywhere? I thought it was wonderful, by the way, that what's his name? Mr. Adjei, David Adjei, that when he designed his building downtown with all the arches, he said, why would I do, at the very start, he said, why would I ever do a glass building in this beautiful neighborhood that's completely made up out of masonry structures? I loved hearing that. Here's a modernist coming in and saying, this neighborhood is important. I want my building to feel like it's a part of this neighborhood.
But also design in general of the interiors and rooms has trickled down is the wrong. It makes it sound. It's become democratized. So Digest, I feel like 40 years ago was more about looking at the houses you couldn't afford and never have, and now design has become so ubiquitous and accessible. Martha Stewart changed the whole way Americans think about the kitchen and how that works. So there have been all these influences that make people have higher standards and essentially be more demanding and expectant of this kind of level of, interior.
That's a fair point, although to be clear, the kinds of buildings that you're designing are, we're talking about not only the luxury market, but really the very top end of the luxury market.
Yes. So people who don't use their kitchens but are at La Grenouille or Majorelle, right?
But there's a range. The building that we just did up by Union Theological Seminary, that for one of our buildings, it's one of our most affordable buildings. I could afford to live there, And so so there's a range depending on the neighborhood.
Right.
I also think there's a thing about people wanting to feel like they belong, and most every city has its architecture, what helps define it. And so, for instance, Rome is a city of stucco and travertine. New York is a city of Indiana limestone and brownstone and brick. People like something that makes them feel like they're part of the city in which they live, part of the place where they live. And I think that's what, we're doing with the work that we do. We're trying to tap into that and make buildings that feel like they grow out of the place and like they belong. And you mentioned this question of how do we differentiate them? We want them to have a familial relationship. Again, they're all of a place. There are things about New York, the climate, the situation. The Indiana limestone historically was because that's the closest place to get limestone. It's Indiana. London is Portland stone, which is the closest. Building with those elements that have defined the places historically and traditionally, I think it really does. People are drawn to that, I think, because it makes them feel like they belong in that place and they're part of that place.
And because of that, by the way, that's the reason why we didn't get hired to do a Miami building for a very long time. Because people always thought, well, you're New York architects, you don't get Miami. But then one of the things that happened during the pandemic is so many New Yorkers started moving down there that developers started to think, maybe we could give the Stern guys a call because they know how to do these plans. And so I went down there and interviewed with the related companies down there. And they said, we know you can do a nice building, you do these beautiful buildings, but there's one thing that Miami buildings are that New York buildings never are. And you're going to have to get this right. And they said, they're sexy. And I said, come on, look at this. I can do this. I can do sexy. Don't worry about it. And I said, give me 2 weeks. And we got it all, pulled out the stops, and we did a glass building. And we did, because in Miami, that's a city of glass towers. And we thought, we turned down glass buildings before. but we thought that in Miami, not in Miami Beach, but in Miami, that we should do a glass building and that we should make it a really good urbanistic glass building, which is what we're trying to do right now.
But in fact, you actually do have a project in the Shore Club in Miami Beach, which is also predominant, lots of glass and, as you mentioned,
But more masonry.
the sexy curves.
Yeah, right,
and,
it does.
And, not exactly things that Ramsay it's not what you think of.
You don't think it's sexy? No.
We needed to do, we're trying to get people used to us being
Depends on
sexy.
your definition, I guess.
We got PR people on this, it's working.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Those buildings in Miami. How do those types of buildings create challenges in terms of doing the kind of sophisticated, appealing interior space planning that you like to do in your buildings?
Well, curves are a challenge. But the trick is that building, the building that we're doing in Miami Beach, for instance, is largely a rectangle with a curve at one end.
Yeah, that's true.
And then so what you do is you put the big living room, on that big curve, and everything else is much more straight than you would imagine. So it's more straightforward than you might think. The most complicated building that we've done that had real curves all over it was actually a building that we worked on together, the Century in LA. That was really, and the way we got that building to work is that it's an oval, but the sides are as flat as we could get them, but still have them curved, and then we have the ends, and so that there are 4 corners in that building that were really hard to work out when you're essentially turning the corner between one curve and another curve. They tended to be balconies, that's how they were worked out. But the curves are always difficult, and you can never sell them to an Asian client. That's the rule. So they don't like curves. But what we're doing down there, by the way, especially in Miami Beach, because it's an historic neighborhood, is that building has punched window facades, and then where it rises up from an historic Art Deco building, and then there are other parts where it sort of loosens up and so opens up to the water. And we actually looked at Gaudi for that building. We thought curves, apartment buildings, who's done this, and then we looked at Gaudi and did something where the windows are much bigger than what he did at the Casa Mila, but we were thinking about looking at how he stacked these curves, and he just stacked them. They're these beautiful sort of wave-like things, but he actually stacked them, and we used that idea and kind of made it in Miami. Sort of one of the ways that we got to our solution.
We're doing on time. We probably need to wrap up soon. One thing I wanted to quickly touch on is, given that New York, and really, with the exception of the Miami buildings we just mentioned, most of these buildings we've been talking about are in New York City. The city has new requirements for energy efficiency and carbon emissions, as well as bird-friendly materials, which we were talking about earlier, for the new construction at least, or renovated buildings. Aesthetics aside, how much benefit do you get with a masonry building in terms of how?
We like the rules they have now, which require us to have more insulation, which means a thicker wall, which we like, right? It works for us, and it works
sculpture.
More sculpture, more depth, more shade and shadow. And I think we all, none of this is controversial. We're all trying to make these buildings perform better.
The bird-friendly is a bit of a nightmare because you have to have polka-dotted windows.
No, but they've come up. There's a solution now.
Yeah, Paul's excellent at polka dots.
Yeah. Well, when they said sexy, I thought polka dots. No, but there is. I forget. I don't know who invented this, but they have bird glass now.
UV.
It has a pattern
Right.
that only birds can see that humans can't see. It's so brilliant. And that's the only reason we did that glass building is after they invented that, because we said otherwise we'd kill all these birds. It would be very sad. Sadder than puppies behind bars. And really sad.
Yeah.
So we feel okay now about our glass building.
Well, I think we have to end here. Panelists will be available after for if you have questions you want to ask them personally, at least for a few minutes. And I want to thank everybody again for coming out, particularly with the braving the smoky conditions. And thank you again to panelists. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Stephen.